What happens when a civilization worships its own bloodline, when kings become gods and the only way to keep divinity pure is to marry your sister? Tonight we open the vault of Egypt's most disturbing dynasty, where power and purity collided inside royal chambers, and the echoes of that choice still pulse through their mummies today. Beneath the gold masks and eternal temples lies a truth written not in hieroglyphs but in DNA. Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, Cleopatra. Every name carved into stone carries a secret that modern science has only begun to uncover, a secret of love turned law, of devotion turned decay. Welcome to X Archives. If you're watching right now, write your country and the time you're tuning in from. We're building a map of those drawn to the forgotten corners of history. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, like the video, and step with us into Egypt's darkest legacy. Because this isn't just the story of kings and queens, it's the story of what happens when power closes its doors too tightly and perfection becomes the one thing a bloodline cannot survive. The gods demanded purity, the humans obeyed, and the cost was everything. When Akhenaten rose to power, Egypt seemed poised for a spiritual awakening. The young pharaoh stood before a nation built on thousands of gods and declared there would be only one, the Aten, the sun made divine. To his court it appeared a revolution of faith, to his enemies a calculated betrayal of tradition. Yet beneath this theological blaze, a quieter rebellion was already unfolding, one that began not in temples but within his own bloodline. Akhenaten's radical new order required legitimacy no council could grant. To dismantle Egypt's priesthood, he needed a sanctity greater than theirs, a divine union. In the private chambers of the royal palace, he found it in the person of his sister. Their marriage was not whispered about, in scandal. It was written in the same language as the gods. For centuries, myth had bound Isis and Osiris as sister and brother, husband and wife. Akhenaten only followed what heaven itself had once permitted. Reliefs carved across Amarna show the pair in unprecedented intimacy, hands clasped, profiles equal. No previous pharaoh had allowed such open parity with a queen. Her titles grew almost overnight: great royal wife, lady of the two lands, mistress of the sun disk. The sculptors gave her the same elongated limbs, the same radiance, the same divine symmetry as her husband. In art, they became reflections, half human, half celestial, an image meant to suggest wholeness, yet hinting at enclosure. For courtiers, the message was clear. The throne was now self-contained. No priest, no foreign princess, no external blood could claim a share in divine power. What began as devotion to the Aten had become a biological barricade. It was governance by purity, an empire turned inward. But even within the murals, cracks show. The children depicted beneath their parents' feet are few, their faces eerily uniform. The genealogies blur. Names vanish between reigns, as if lineage itself faltered under the weight of its own sanctity. In trying to embody divine unity, Akhenaten had also ensured isolation. Historians would later search these tomb walls for truth and find only patterns, the same faces repeating, the same narrow chins, the same fragile frames. What they uncovered was not merely devotion, but a dynasty circling itself, convinced that godhood could be inherited if kept undiluted. Akhenaten's revolution, once blazing with the light of a single god, left behind another kind of radiance, the shimmer of genes looping endlessly within one family. The empire called it holiness. Science would one day call it consequence. And in that union of faith and blood, the first thread of a Bel-Bei, tragedy was quietly sown, an empire promising eternity even as its heirs began to fade. When Akhenaten rose to power, Egypt seemed poised for a spiritual awakening. The young pharaoh stood before a nation built on thousands of gods and declared there would be only one, the Aten, the sun made divine. To his court it appeared a revolution of faith, to his enemies a calculated betrayal of tradition. Yet beneath this theological blaze a quieter rebellion was already unfolding, one that began not in temples but within his own bloodline. Akhenaten's radical new order required legitimacy no council could grant. To dismantle Egypt's priesthood, he needed a sanctity greater than theirs, a divine union. In the private chambers of the royal palace, he found it in the person of his sister. Their marriage was not whispered about in scandal. It was written in the same language as the gods. For centuries, myth had bound Isis and Osiris as sister and brother, husband and wife. Akhenaten only followed what heaven itself had once permitted. Reliefs carved across Amarna show the pair in unprecedented intimacy. Hands clasped, profiles equal. No previous pharaoh had allowed such open parity with a queen. Her titles grew almost overnight. Great royal wife, lady of the two lands, mistress of the sun disk. The sculptors gave her the same elongated limbs, the same radiance, the same divine symmetry as her husband. In art, they became reflections, half human, half celestial, an image meant to suggest wholeness, yet hinting at enclosure. For courtiers, the message was clear. The throne was now self-contained. No priest, no foreign princess, no external blood could claim a share in divine power. What began as devotion to the Aten had become a biological barricade. It was governance by purity, an empire turned inward. But even within the murals, cracks show. The children depicted beneath their parents' feet are few, their faces eerily uniform. The genealogies blur, names vanish between and reigns, as if lineage itself faltered under the weight of its own sanctity. In trying to embody divine unity, Akhenaten had also ensured isolation. Historians would later search these tomb walls for truth and find only patterns, the same faces repeating, the same narrow chins, the same fragile frames. What they uncovered was not merely devotion, but a dynasty circling itself, convinced that godhood could be inherited if kept undiluted. Akhenaten's revolution, once blazing with the light of a single god, left behind another kind of radiance, the shimmer of genes looping endlessly within one family. The empire called it holiness. Science would one day call it consequence. And in that union of faith and blood, the first thread of a tragedy was quietly sown, an empire promising eternity, even as its heirs began to fade. He arrives too young for the weight of a crown. The court calls him Tutankhamun, then Tutankhamun, as if changing a name could mend a nation. Advisors guide his hand across decrees, priests return to old temples. The Aten's glare softens into the familiar gaze of Amun. On the surface, restoration. Beneath it, a quieter truth. The new pharaoh is the outcome of a closed circle. The throne room knows it even if it never says it aloud. His parents were not simply royal, they were kin, full siblings bound by a policy that made blood a fortress. The boy king sits inside that fortress every day. It is grandeur but also a narrow hallway with no doors. Years pass quickly when power moves around you. Statues go up. Offerings resume, the kingdom exhales, yet the king's body tells its own story. Stiffness, pain that bites without ceremony, steps that need support. None of this is unique in a hard world, but the pattern matters. When a dynasty folds in on itself, each small weakness has a chance to echo. Centuries later, when the desert gives up his tomb and science learns to listen to bones, the private ledger of his body opens. CT scans map the angles of his limbs and the architecture of his skull. DNA work threads relationships through time, pairing the anonymous with the known. A male from KV-45 aligns with the boy king. A younger lady from KV-35 aligns as well. Together, they resolve the equation everyone suspected, parents not just royal but brother and sister. From there, the findings do not shout, they accumulate. A foot that betrays him, hints of compromised immunity, markers of strain rather than a single dramatic cause. It is not a morality tale and not a list of afflictions for spectacle. It is a portrait of inheritance under pressure, a lineage compressed by design. Link the ailments to policy, not pity. The palace chose to keep power inside a sealed loop. Sacred title. Concentrated, estates locked, legitimacy purified until it became fragile. In that loop, recessive risks met each generation with slightly longer odds. The boy king carried the mathematics of that choice. He reigned with ceremony and counsel, but he also reigned with consequences that no decree could repeal. When he dies, restoration halts mid-sentence. The famous mask will outshine the data for a long time, but the data endure. They explain less about his character than about the system that produced him. What the scans and sequences reveal is not a single culprit, but a structure, an elite convinced that divinity could be preserved by narrowing the circle. So we are left with a body that governed briefly and a genome that testifies longer. If this is what one carefully buried king discloses, how many others walked that same corridor, beautifully adorned, clinically vulnerable, and never knew the cost of the crown written into their blood? At the heart of the 18th dynasty stood a daughter who refused to remain a footnote. Hatshepsut was born royal twice, through her father, Thutmose I, and through a mother of noble blood. Yet in a court where kingship flowed almost exclusively through men, birthright alone was never enough. She secured her place the way dynasties always had, by sealing the circle. Her husband, Thutmose II, was also her half-brother. Their marriage looked like custom. In truth, it was her strategy. When Thutmose I died, rival branches of the royal line jostled for legitimacy. The priests favored continuity, and nothing was more continuous than blood that looped back on itself. As king's daughter, king's sister, king's wife, Hatshepsut embodied every title the gods had once approved. Her coronation drew on that trinity. She could stand before Amun's statue and claim the throne not as an intruder, but as destiny's fulfillment. Thutmose II's reign flickered briefly before illness took him, leaving an infant heir from a secondary wife. Hatshepsut stepped into the gap. Not as usurper, she insisted, but as guardian of divine order. She invoked lineage as law, arguing that the god Amun himself had sired her through her father. In temple reliefs, she appears not beside men, but before them, clothed in royal regalia, crowned with both serpent and beard. Each inscription repeats the same silent argument. Blood legitimizes power, therefore my blood legitimizes me. Deir el-Bahri, her mortuary temple, carries that argument in stone. Its terraces rise like a proclamation of inevitability. Scenes show her birth attended by gods, her coronation blessed by the same. Yet, within the grandeur lies absence. Thutmose II fades from record, his image is small, his name secondary. The marriage that once anchored her rule becomes a shadow behind her authority. For nearly 2 decades, Egypt flourished under her vision. Trade restored, temples revived, order restitched, but power won through blood carried a flaw no builder could chisel away. To defend her reign, Hatshepsut had fused legitimacy with ancestry so tightly that every successor would be forced to do the same. The model endured, a dynasty tightening upon itself, each generation claiming purity, each narrowing the path a little further. When her name was later chiseled from monuments, it was not only revenge, it was the recoil of a system she perfected. By using blood as proof, she taught future rulers that the throne required nothing beyond its own reflection, and in that mirror of lineage, the seeds of confinement were sown. Her strategy had worked. A woman became king. But her method, binding authority to heredity, would echo long after her temple fell silent, turning divine birth from blessing into the first curse of the royal line. By the 13th century BCE, the throne of Egypt belonged to a man who seemed larger than the gods he served. Ramesses II, the Great, ruled longer, built more, and fathered more heirs than almost any king before him. His monuments declared endurance, his statues omnipresence. But even he faced a problem that power could not endlessly postpone: succession within an empire already crowded by his own blood. Dozens of sons stood in line, their mothers drawn from palaces, harems, and alliances. Yet among his many children, 2 daughters, Bintanath and Meritamen, rose above the rest, crowned with titles that turned eyes and ink alike: Great Royal Wife. The inscriptions sound absolute, yet their meaning dissolves under scrutiny. Were these designations ceremonial, or did they imply something deeper, something the royal house would rather we not define too closely? Reliefs from Abu Simbel and Thebes place these daughters beside Ramesses in poses reserved for queens. Each holds a lotus, each stands nearly equal in height to her father. The scenes blur devotion and divinity, suggesting that affection had less to do with sentiment than with optics. In Egypt, symbolism was currency. To appear beside the living god was to extend his cosmic order. To be named Great Royal Wife was to act as a mirror, a partner in state liturgy, not necessarily in private chambers. Some scholars see the titles as honorary, a gesture acknowledging loyalty and proximity. Others suspect a subtler political mechanism. By elevating his daughters, Ramesses blocked rival queens from foreign bloodlines and kept the dynasty self-contained. A pharaoh surrounded by family needed no foreign treaty bride. His house was Egypt itself. This ambiguity is precisely what makes the period so uneasy. The same inscriptions that celebrate divine order also conceal the cost of maintaining it. Ramesses' family became the living symbol of empire, an organism of ceremony, not intimacy. His daughters, whatever their private fates, served as continuations of his image. Their marriages, if real if not, functioned as policy statements. Egypt would wed only itself. The surviving evidence refuses to settle the debate. A few titles, a handful of reliefs, the silence of tomb walls, that is all that remains. No decree clarifies intent. The ambiguity, perhaps deliberate, preserved both reverence and denial. In the end, what did wife mean when every role served the throne? A title could sanctify affection or erase it. An embrace could be ritual, not desire. For Ramesses, the boundary between family and empire vanished beneath the same chisel. His daughters stood beside him as symbols of stability, yet their presence whispered a deeper truth. The closer Egypt's rulers drew their circle, the thinner the line between dynasty and devotion became. When Alexander's general Ptolemy seized Egypt, he inherited more than a throne. He inherited an idea. To rule the Nile, he needed more than armies. He needed continuity, a divine aura that Greek conquest alone could not provide. Egypt's people expected their ruler to be God-born, descended from divine pairs whose bloodlines circled like the sun. The new dynasty, Greek in speech and Macedonian in habit, saw an opportunity hidden within that mythology. If sibling marriage had sanctified the old pharaohs, it could sanctify the conquerors as well. At first it was mimicry, dressed as respect. Ptolemy and his queen Berenice there ruled conventionally, securing the realm through alliances and legitimacy borrowed from Alexander's name. But by the next generation, imitation hardened into doctrine. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus wed his full sister Arsinoe II, establishing a precedent that transformed imitation into law. The poets and priests of Alexandria dutifully rewrote the story. Theirs was not human affection, but divine reflection, a rebirth of Isis and Osiris. In papyrus, hymns, and marble inscriptions, the siblings' love became the spine of the state religion. Each union tightened the circle. Land, titles, and temples fused into a self-contained system where husband and wife shared not only power, but property, cult, and genome. The royal cult, a blend of Greek ceremony and Egyptian theology, worshipped the pair as living gods, ensuring that devotion to rulers became devotion to their shared blood. Priests gained patronage, the populace gained spectacle, and the monarchy gained the illusion of eternity. But divinity had a cost. The dynasty's genealogies began to twist upon themselves. Half-brothers marrying half-sisters, nieces joining uncles, cousins becoming queens. To outsiders, it looked like decadence. To insiders, it was governance. By refusing foreign brides, the Ptolemies kept wealth undivided and loyalties predictable. In the arithmetic of empire, incest was stability. Inscribed dedications from temple walls and fragments of poets like Posidippus leave no moral judgment, only awe. They describe processions of gold and ivory, twin thrones under a single canopy, rulers whose faces mirrored each other so precisely that sculptors carved them from one block of marble. Beneath that symmetry lay fragility. As generations passed, heirs grew fewer, disputes sharper. Blood became a border none dared cross until politics itself suffocated within the family it sought to preserve. By the time later Ptolemies inherited this engineered purity, the circle had turned cage. Civil wars erupted between siblings, raised to love as rivals, worship as spouses, and govern as gods. What began as a clever translation of Egyptian sanctity into Greek monarchy evolved into an institution of confinement. Control had produced purity, purity had produced isolation, and isolation in time would produce collapse, not by invasion or rebellion, but by the slow implosion of a family too divine to breathe. Long after the crowns of gold had tarnished and the line of the Ptolemies had ended, their customs lingered, not in palaces, but in papyrus. Deep in the archives of Roman Egypt, ordinary villagers continued a tradition once reserved for gods and kings. The Oxyrhynchus census rolls, written in the careful hands of local scribes, record the same unsettling pattern repeated across generations. Brothers and sisters listed as husband and wife. At first, the numbers seemed too strange to believe. In some districts, more than 1 in 10 households registers a sibling union, in others nearly 1 in 5. These were not royal pretenders or cult devotees. They were farmers, weavers, clerks, citizens under Roman law, who found in this practice something practical, not divine. Economics, not devotion, shaped their choices. Land in Roman Egypt was often inherited in rigid parcels. By marrying within the family, property stayed intact. Dowries stayed local. Tax obligations remained predictable. What had once been theology under the Pharaohs became accounting under the empire. The word incest does not appear in these documents, only signatures, ages, and assets. To the bureaucracy, lineage mattered less than revenue. Yet the imitation is haunting. The same society that built its identity around Roman order still mirrored the dead monarchs of a vanished world. A peasant might never see a temple relief, but the myth of divine siblings persisted like background radiation. In marriage contracts and census lines, the model lived on, stripped of marble and ritual, now an administrative convenience dressed as tradition. Archaeologists and demographers still debate how literal these records were. Some may reflect legal fiction, formal declarations to retain property rights rather than true conjugal unions. Others hint that the practice was genuine, tolerated by local custom, though in vitae aeternam, Sibyl in Roman statutes. Either way, the effect was the same, a closed circle, not of gods, but of households. The papyri reveal no judgment, only structure. Each entry is a whisper of normalcy. A brother, a sister, a shared estate, a line of ink confirming what power once made sacred. The dynasty had fallen, yet its social logic remained intact. Purity as security, isolation as inheritance. It's tempting to see imitation here, peasants echoing palaces, but perhaps it wasn't mimicry at all. Perhaps they found in the same pattern the same efficiency their rulers once claimed as holiness. When power teaches a society that keeping blood unbroken preserves order, the idea doesn't vanish with the dynasty. It filters downward, softening into habit. 2 millennia later, the papyri still ask the same question. When ordinary people copy kings, is it reverence or resignation? The story of Egypt's rulers is, at its core, a study in concentration, the same principle that made their empire formidable: control, containment, continuity, governed their blood. Each generation tightened the loop, convinced that purity preserved power. In reality, it only preserved weakness that could no longer be diluted. Genetically, the equation was simple but unforgiving. A full brother and sister share half their DNA. When they reproduce, hidden recessive traits, those silent, harmless variables, find each other. What had been dormant in one generation awakens in the next. Over time, the line narrows, the odds worsen, and fragility becomes inheritance. Tutankhamun embodies that equation. The CT scans of his remains expose not a curse, but a pattern: clubfoot, malformed spine, brittle bones. His parents, confirmed by DNA analysis, were full siblings. The boy's ailments were not punishment from the gods but arithmetic, an outcome written in the ledgers of biology long before his birth. He wasn't alone. The Amarna lineage shows similar fragility. The same elongated features that sculptors once carved as divine now appear as distortions born of repetition. The royal children who followed were few, many dying before adolescence. Behind the grandeur of gold masks and stone reliefs, the reality was clinical, an empire breeding within itself. Later dynasties echoed the pattern. The Ramessides, though less confined, still favored unions within the royal circle. Ptolemaic heirs married sisters, nieces, or cousins to consolidate cult power and wealth. Each generation inherited not only the throne, but the accumulated errors of its predecessors. For every monument that proclaimed eternity, the genealogy beneath it whispered impermanence. Yet the system was logical within its own boundaries. To share blood with the king was to share legitimacy. To marry beyond it was to risk dilute. The very policy designed to immortalize the line also made it mortal. Infant graves near royal necropolises testify to that quiet attrition, tiny sarcophagi carrying the statistical price of sovereignty. Science now fills the silence those tombs left behind. Genomic sequencing reveals skeletal deformities, immune deficiencies, and patterns consistent with inbreeding depression. The findings are dry, factual, almost sterile, and all the more devastating for it. Dynasties that sought divine perfection instead engineered genetic decline. It's not myth, but mathematics. Power drawn too tightly collapses under its own precision. The pharaohs believed they could freeze divinity in blood, that eternity could be bred like marble. But eternity needs variation. It thrives on imperfection. Each sealed union narrowed the pool. Each generation carried the weight of its ancestors' choices. By the time the last pharaohs walked their halls, the divine blood they guarded had become a fragile relic. Sacred, yes, but unsustainable. Every empire decays first in its genes, long before its monuments fall. The stone endures longer than the lineage, and beneath that endurance lies the quiet truth Egypt never meant to teach. Perfection, once preserved too carefully, begins to rot. By the close of the New Kingdom, Egypt still looked eternal on the surface, temples standing firm, the Nile repeating its ancient rhythm, but the bloodline that had once claimed divine continuity was thinning. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses II ruled shorter, weaker reigns, their genealogies blurred by uncertainty. What had been a dynasty of families became a patchwork of individuals, priests, generals, and opportunists wearing crowns borrowed from memory. The royal family tree, once expansive enough to fill walls with branches and titles, began to contract. Few heirs, fewer daughters of royal birth, and fewer marriages that could be traced within the same lineage. The system that had protected divinity by keeping it close had reached its natural limit: isolation. When the 21st dynasty emerged around 1069 BCE, the illusion of sacred inheritance was already breaking. The priesthood of Amun, once subordinate to the throne, now shared power with it. High priests of Thebes acted as kings in the south, while nominal pharaohs ruled from the north. For the first time, Egypt had two centers of authority, and neither could claim pure divine descent. The genetic insulation that once symbolized holiness now mirrored the country's political suffocation. Dynastic blood had become so narrowly defined that it could no longer sustain continuity. Alliances that might have rejuvenated the line were rejected, and as the royal pool dried up, the priestly class stepped in to fill the vacuum. Their marriages were not to siblings but to opportunity. The throne no longer belonged to a lineage but to whoever could secure its temples. Records from this era speak less of family than of administration. Cartouches multiply without clarity. Names repeat without relation. Tomb inscriptions praise loyalty, not blood. The very language of kingship shifts from divine birthright to divine favor. Power becomes transferable, its legitimacy no longer biological, but ritual. Archaeology bears witness to this quiet disintegration. Royal tombs shrink, burial goods diminish. Genealogies end midline. In Thebes, priests and pharaohs share burial grounds, a mingling that would have been unthinkable a century before. The once sacred boundary between royal and common blood fades into bureaucracy. By the 22nd dynasty, outsiders of Libyan origin ascend the throne, still calling themselves sons of Ra, but with no real claim to that lineage. The blood that had defined empire is gone, absorbed into the population it once ruled. The irony is unmistakable. The dynasties that guarded their purity most zealously left the fewest descendants. Divine isolation had preserved image, not survival. Egypt's rulers had bred their myth so efficiently that it could outlive them, even as their genes disappeared into silence. By the end of the 21st dynasty, the pharaoh's bloodline was a whisper. Their monuments still stood, their gods still named, but the bodies that once carried those names had grown too rare to continue. Genetic isolation had found its mirror in politics, a kingdom divided, a lineage dissolved, and a legacy left to strangers who called themselves its sons. In November of 1922, when Howard Carter's chisel broke the plaster seal on a forgotten doorway in the Valley of the Kings, he could not have known he was also cracking open the genetic vault of an entire civilization. The candles flickered against walls untouched for 3,000 years, illuminating gold, wood, and linen, a treasury of preservation that time had spared for science to rediscover. Tutankhamun's tomb, small but untouched, offered not just relics but raw data, a complete royal body, waiting to tell its story again, this time to microscopes instead of priests. For the world, it was a spectacle of wonder. For researchers, it became a controlled experiment in mortality. Early examinations found anomalies in the boy's frame: a clubbed foot, a curved spine, brittle bones that hinted at frailty behind the glamour. Yet it would take nearly a century for those clues to align. In 2010, a multidisciplinary team led by Zahi Hawass published in JAMA what became the most ambitious DNA study ever attempted on Egyptian royalty. 11 mummies, spanning 5 generations of the 18th dynasty, were tested. Short tandem repeats mapped bloodlines with statistical precision, confirming what history had whispered. Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings. The study also traced his grandparents, aunts and uncles, reconstructing a family tree whose branches curved inward rather than outward. Modern science had verified what ancient art had idealized, a dynasty obsessed with unity at the cost of vitality. CT scans added new dimensions to the findings. The damage once blamed on murder was revealed as post-mortem mishandling. The boy's broken leg, possibly fractured days before death, showed signs of infection. The combination of a compromised immune system and malaria likely sealed his fate. He was not assassinated, he was inherited collapse. But even this forensic triumph, ride caveats. DNA extraction from mummies degraded by millennia of heat and resin is perilous. Contamination is constant, sample sizes are small, and conclusions are careful, not absolute. Still, the results reshaped Egyptology. Where once the narrative centered on tomb curses and royal grandeur, it now turned to genetics, pathology, and probability. The parallels are striking. Ancient priests once read omens from entrails and stars. Modern researchers read code from molecules and bone. Both sought meaning in mortality. Both built rituals around preservation. The sarcophagus became a data archive, the autopsy table a new altar. Through science, the pharaohs regained voices stripped of myth, frail, factual, and human. Their divinity was not erased, but redefined, eternal not in soul, but in sequence. When Carter first peered into that chamber and declared he saw wonderful things, he spoke for an age of archaeology. A century later, the wonders endure, not in gold, but in genomes. And in that eerie symmetry, modern science has become the new priesthood, translating bones into truth and judging the kings it once worshipped. In the temples of Egypt, stone spoke louder than blood. The pharaoh and his queen, often brother and sister, stood immortalized in perfect symmetry, carved not as two people but as one ideal form. Each relief, each statue, each painted wall repeated the same declaration. Divine balance was not born, it was constructed. Through image, the forbidden became sacred. From the earliest dynasties, art carried the burden of legitimacy. Where words could be questioned, images endured without argument. In the reliefs of Thutmose II and Hatshepsut, we see the pattern begin. The half-sibling pair is shown facing one another, identical in proportion and posture. Her hand touches his arm not as a lover, but as an equal, a mirror gesture sanctified by repetition. On temple walls, she is king's wife and king's sister in hieroglyphs placed deliberately side by side. The titles merge devotion and ancestry until they are indistinguishable. By the Ptolemaic era, this iconography hardened into liturgy. Greek sculptors adapted the old forms to new marble, their chisels tracing what the dynasty's marriages proclaimed, the divine pair reborn. Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II appear as Isis and Osiris, enthroned together beneath twin suns. Their faces are nearly identical, their crowns interchangeable. The viewer was not meant to see two rulers, but one continuous divinity, two halves completing the cosmic circle. This visual grammar achieved what policy alone could not. It normalized what might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. The union of siblings, repeated across stone and temple doorways, became less a transgression than a tradition. Every subject who gazed upon the twin figures was reminded that the gods themselves had loved within their own bloodline. To question the marriage of brother and sister was to question the order of the heavens. Art replaced argument, reliefs multiplied in temples from Rom Thebes to Dendera, showing brother-sister pairs offering incense, crowning each other, sharing the same halo of divinity. Even the smallest amulets echoed the motif. Twin serpents entwined, twin falcons perched upon one staff. The image transcended life. It became doctrine. But time is unkind to absolutes. As dynasties waned, the human flaws beneath the divine facade began to show. The same symmetry that once embodied balance started to look like confinement. Sculptures from later reigns reveal stiffness, hollow eyes, subtle asymmetry, as if the stone itself could sense strain. The illusion of wholeness no longer convinced. Still, the art outlived the blood. The lineage thinned, but the carvings remained flawless. Generations later, when no royal pair survived to imitate the gods, the walls continued to perform the ritual alone. These images preserved what genetics destroyed. They fossilized the perfection the body could not sustain, and in the silence of abandoned temples, the stone figures still face one another, locked in eternal symmetry, unaware that the harmony they proclaim had long since broken within the bones of their makers. By the 2nd century BCE, the royal line of the Ptolemies had become an Ouroboros, each generation consuming itself in the name of purity. What began as divine imitation had turned into political suffocation. The dynasty that once wielded sibling marriage as a symbol of unbreakable order now found it an engine of chaos. The logic had seemed flawless. By marrying brother to sister, the throne stayed closed to outsiders. Power remained indivisible. Yet when every claimant shared the same blood, the question of succession became unsolvable. Who ruled when all were equally divine? The reign of Ptolemy VIII offers the clearest fracture. He married his sister Cleopatra II to consolidate the dynasty, then married her daughter Cleopatra III to secure heirs. The union that had once represented holy continuity now produced civil war. Mother, daughter, and husband each claimed divine legitimacy. Temples split allegiance, and royal decrees bore signatures that contradicted one another. For the first time, Egypt's divine household became its own battlefield, without swords, but with proclamations and poison. Inscriptions from this period grow erratic, as though the record keepers no longer knew which monarch to serve. One stela praises the royal pair, but fails to specify which pair it means. The royal titles had become interchangeable, the iconography incoherent. To outsiders, the confusion was opportunity. Rome watched closely. Its envoys arrived under the guise of arbitration, promising to mediate between feuding siblings. Each claimant courted their favor, offering bribes disguised as alliances. What began as family discord evolved into dependency. The empire that had once built walls of lineage now found itself surrounded by Roman diplomacy, iron not forged by war, but by inheritance disputes. By the time Cleopatra VII ascended a century later, the royal family had exhausted its vocabulary of unity. Every new marriage to a brother or cousin was less about sanctity and more about desperation. The divine model had collapsed under its own weight. No battlefields need be described to see the cost. The throne was a chamber crowded with family and none who could be trusted. Every alliance carried memory of betrayal. Every heir was also a rival. The myth of eternal purity had birthed a system that devoured its children one succession at a time. Historians sometimes call this the theology of containment, a structure that trapped power so tightly it began to implode. The gods of old had ruled beside their siblings in harmony. The Ptolemies ruled beside theirs in paranoia. By the dynasty's final century, the marble palaces of Alexandria still gleamed, but the blood inside them was tired. The throne remained gilded, surrounded by statues of divine couples, yet the man or woman seated upon it was always alone, heir to a system that had turned every bond of kinship into a weapon. For centuries, Egypt's pharaohs were painted as immortal, divine bodies immune to time and decay. But when their tombs were opened, divinity gave way to anatomy. The gilded coffins hid not perfection, but frailty, not eternity, but evidence. Beneath layers of linen and resin, modern science uncovered the scars of a dynasty's design. Tutankhamun's body remains the most telling record. CT scans reveal a skeleton that struggled against itself, a clubbed left foot, scoliosis along the spine, a cleft palate, and fragile bones that fractured even before death. His skull, long romanticized as graceful and alien, is revealed instead as asymmetrical, its structure shaped by inheritance rather than idealized beauty. These were not random ailments, they were the cumulative arithmetic of generations marrying too closely. DNA sequencing confirmed what tomb inscriptions hinted. His parents were full siblings, products of the Amana lineage's experiment in divine purity. The defects, once interpreted as royal uniqueness, are now read as biological consequence. Even his walking sticks, more than 100 found in the tomb, speak to a life spent compensating for pain. He was not the only one. Mummies from nearby dynasties tell quieter variations of the same story. CT imaging of Ahmose Meritamun shows spinal curvature and joint degeneration. Others reveal premature tooth wear and bone thinning. Though the evidence is limited, samples scarce, preservation inconsistent, the pattern repeats often enough to disturb coincidence. Within these sarcophagi, health declined long before empire did. To the ancients, these deformities carried no shame. They were not proof of imperfection, but reminders of divine closeness. A frail body could still carry godhood and perhaps, in their theology, suffering elevated sanctity. But viewed through the lens of genetics, the truth is less poetic. Isolation, however, noble in theory, eroded resilience. The royal genome, hemmed in by ritual, began to fold inward. What strikes modern observers is not the morbidity, but the humanity. The cracked femurs, the fused vertebrae, the malformed skulls, each represents a life lived under ceremonial weight, a person who bore the physical toll of belief. These were individuals trapped between symbolism and survival. Their pain was private, yet preserved for eternity by the very rituals meant to honor them. Science reads these bodies clinically, but there is tragedy beneath the data. The pharaohs were architects of their own fragility, shaping eternity through marriage contracts and tomb blueprints, never realizing both were built on the same narrowing foundation. Their bones tell a story the hieroglyphs never confessed. The price of keeping gods in the family was written not in bloodlines, but in bone. And as the bandages fall away, each royal mummy reveals that immortality came with a cost, one measured not in years or kingdoms, but in the quiet suffering of bodies born to bear the weight of divinity. In the centuries since Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, Egypt's royal bloodline has been repackaged into headlines sharper than any chisel: incest pharaohs and "Tut died of inbreeding," phrases that travel faster than hieroglyphs ever could. The story of dynastic strategy has been rewritten as spectacle, a morality play in which science becomes gossip and history becomes shorthand. Yet the truth, preserved in laboratories and archives, is quieter and far stranger. Only a handful of royal unions are confirmed as full sibling marriages, and even those existed inside a complex system of politics, ritual, and theology. Most pharaohs married strategically within extended families or priestly lineages, not out of desire, but obligation. The famous DNA study of 2010 never claimed that all kings were products of incest. It described a single generation's genetic pattern. But nuance rarely survives the journey from journal to headline. Modern documentaries often repeat these distortions, flattening centuries into a single diagnosis. The narrative becomes lurid, divine arrogance punished by deformity, royalty undone by lust for power and kin. In truth, the record says less about scandal and more about bureaucracy. Sibling marriage in Egypt functioned as administrative control, a legal mechanism to guard estates, not a family obsession. What we call taboo was, in their eyes, a ledger entry sanctified by religion. The danger of simplification is not just inaccuracy, it is erasure. When every pharaoh is portrayed as a victim of incest, the real question of how ideology shaped biology is lost. The horror lies not in the sensational but in the systemic. How a government encoded belief into blood, how faith became legislation, how ritual hardened into genetics. For channels like The Seventh Mark, the challenge is to restore proportion without dulling unease. The aim is not to sanitize heist, but to reveal its precision, a civilization that engineered divinity through marriage contracts, convinced holiness could be maintained by calculation. The dread is not that these rulers were monstrous, but that they were methodical. Revisiting the evidence, the pattern becomes less about scandal and more about repetition. Decisions made logically, consequences endured silently. The CT scans and DNA charts are not tabloid curiosities, they are receipts. They document what happens when policy overrides biology, when devotion becomes data. In the end, modern Egyptology is not unmasking depravity, but recovering intent. Behind every headline is paperwork, not passion. Behind every mummy, an administrative choice. So the task is simple, if not easy, to replace spectacle with substance, to let dread emerge from accuracy, not exaggeration, because with clarity comes the deeper fear, that the past was never reckless at all, only precise, and that precision was the true tragedy. History rarely ends, it echoes. The temples are dust now, the tombs sealed, yet the pattern remains, a circle drawn too tightly around itself. The pharaohs believed they could preserve eternity by controlling who entered their bloodline. They succeeded only in proving how power collapses when it refuses to share. The marriages that once held kingdoms together now read like cautionary footnotes. The divine unions of brother and sister were never about passion, they were systems, bureaucratic blueprints for containment. Each generation tightened the design, each alliance trimmed the edges of diversity until the structure itself began to suffocate. What ended Egypt's golden age was not invasion alone, but exhaustion from within. A lineage can decay the same way an empire does. Slowly, predictably, from too much sameness. The biological consequences are visible, but the larger truth is political. Every regime that confuses purity with stability begins the same way, convinced that closing ranks preserves strength. The pattern recurs through history, courts, dynasties, corporations, even ideologies that believe outsiders dilute greatness. The pharaohs wrote that belief in stone, others have written it in law. The result is always identical, power turning inward until it feeds on itself. Egypt's story is the most elegant example of that truth because it hides the lesson beneath perfection. Its art never trembles, its architecture never hesitates, yet inside that precision lived fragility. The same drive that built monuments capable of surviving millennia also engineered a human lineage that could not survive its own ideals. The mummies now resting in glass cases are not just artifacts, they are testimonies. Each preserved ribcage and vertebra is a record of decisions made by people who believed divinity could be inherited like property. Science names it inbreeding, history calls it hubris. But underneath both lies something human, fear of dilution, fear of loss, fear that what we build will vanish if we let anyone else hold it. Their legacy lingers beyond genetics. It lingers in the instinct to close borders, to define worth by bloodline, to measure purity instead of adaptability. The faces in the museums remind us that control disguised as order always decays into isolation. So what remains? A story written in DNA, a warning etched into marble, and a question that refuses burial. The royal sister bride may be gone, her crown scattered across dynasties, but her lesson endures, in boardrooms, in borders, in the quiet arrogance of systems that mistake exclusion for survival. Power that shuts its doors long enough begins to echo in an empty room, and eventually, like the royal families of Egypt, it learns too late that what is sealed off from the world does not last, it starves. The monuments endure, the bloodlines do not. Eternity, it turns out, cannot be inherited.